All right, we are back here on the Just End the Suffering podcast. Joining me today to break down the offseason for the locals as they get ready for the draft, Darryl Slater is here. Darryl, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks again for coming on. And I got to say, the locals have had a very interesting offseason. I think the Giants more aggressive than the Jets, but it has been at least interesting to see what the New York football teams are up to.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, a couple big splash receiver acquisitions in free agency. Corey Davis going to the Jets, Kenny Galladay to the Giants. And so these teams doing what they can to kind of upgrade their offense. Obviously, the Giants splurging more so than the Jets here as they try to take advantage of the rookie contract window of Daniel Jones, and the Jets, of course, going to be starting over at quarterback almost certainly with Zach Wilson as they hit the reset button on that rookie contract window.
Yeah, I want to start with the Giants. You brought up the two big signings they made, Kenny Galladay and Dory Jackson. They threw a lot of money out there. I mean, aside from the Patriots, they probably spent some of the biggest guarantees on contracts the offseason. Do you think those were overpays for those two guys?
Oh, definitely. I mean, and that's just the nature of free agency. I think that, yeah, for sure. Dory Jackson is a really good player when he's healthy, but there's injury concerns there. Kenny Galladay coming off an injury-plagued season and really has not proven it over the long haul. But if you look at where the Giants were at, I mean, they had to kind of paper over past mistakes by Dave Gettleman, whether they're in the draft or free agency signings. And that's really what free agency amounts to. It's a corrective measure and one in which you have to overpay if you're not able to build your team through the draft, which ideally is what most teams want to do. So obviously for Gettleman, the DeAndre Baker draft pick didn't work out. He has not been able to find a number 2 cornerback to play opposite James Bradbury, who has been a very good signing. And then, of course, the Golden Tate signing did not work out at receiver for the Giants. So here they are. Dory Jackson, Kenny Galladay coming in for big money. And, really the Galladay contract is obviously much more significant and larger, and it ties the Giants to him for a good stretch of time here, really 3 years at least. And they're going to wind up paying him a lot of money one way or the other. So he really has to play much better than he has in order to deliver on that contract.
Yeah, it also feels like a lot of times that teams like this who's paying the big bucks are in a situation where they feel like the front office has to win right now, retain their job. This is Dave Gettleman's 4th year. Based on what they've been doing this offseason, do you think he feels that pressure he has to win this year or else he might be out of a job?
I mean, he should, right? I mean, like they said last year, they were running John Merritt said last year before the season that he was kind of running out of patience, whatever. And then they go out and have finished 6-10. And it sort of gets masked by the fact that, they did finish strong after a really crummy start, and the fact that they were in the division race because their division is bad. So, I think that John Mara would love for this to work with Dave Gettleman, but the bottom line is if they win 6 games again, I mean, that would be 6-11 with the new 17-game schedule. I just don't see any way that he should be retained. I mean, who knows at this point? They've shown a lot of patience with Gettleman, but these are win now moves, and then you have to look at the Giants and say, are they capable of winning now and saving Dave Gettleman's job? And really, that's not the motivation for the players. I mean, they want to win, period. But are they capable of winning now? I mean, they have a lot of problems on the offensive line. They're basically going to run it back with the same offensive line as last year. That has to be a concern, for Daniel Jones. And then Daniel Jones is in a vacuum. Like, who is he as a quarterback, right? I mean, is he actually a franchise quarterback? So ideally, yeah, you want to take advantage of your rookie quarterbacks, of your quarterback's rookie contract window. I mean, the Eagles did it with Carson Wentz before he kind of flamed out and got, and had injury issues and performance issues. So they won a Super Bowl that way. So once the quarterback gets to be a lot more expensive, then it really hamstrings you in terms of what else you can do. At this point, the Giants are entering 19, 20, 21, year 3 with Daniel Jones. And so they have to figure out, in these next few years, and they have his 5th-year option too, what can they build around this guy, and is he worth building around?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a good point. Especially the offensive line. I feel like that's probably their biggest need entering the draft. What other needs do you think they have besides the line? Yeah,
I think, as you look at it, edge rusher and really the outside linebacker position for the Giants is a fairly significant issue. I mean, they brought back Leonard Williams as a pass rushing presence. Let's see if he can do, now that he got paid, what he did last year on a contract year. And He got a huge payday. We mentioned Jackson and Galladay, but they invested pretty heavily in Leonard Williams as well, and they almost had to at this point because after the trade and franchise tagging him, they were almost stuck to the point where they had to pay him big money. So I think offensive line obviously is an issue outside of they have Andrew Thomas. They don't know what they have in him, but it's not like they're going to be starting over at left tackle this quickly. And then outside linebacker, O'Shane Ximenez, Lorenzo Carter, both dealt with injuries last year. You don't really know what you have in those guys. Those are homegrown guys who you drafted. You'd love to see them if you're the Giants take that next step, but are they ready to do that? So that's where you could look at the Giants perhaps drafting an edge rusher at 11 in this draft. They got maybe a guy like Gregory Rousseau or Jalen Phillips, both played at Miami. So yeah, I think those are two big issues. One on offense there on the line, and one on defense at outside linebacker.
Yeah, I feel like those are the two areas they could go 11. I know Rashawn Slater's a popular pick for the Giants 11, but do you think, I know Dave Gettleman hates to trade back. Do you think there's a scenario here where the Giants could sit there and say, okay, maybe the board didn't shake out what we like, or there's a surplus here, we can go back at a few more picks and get a guy that we feel comfortable with at like 15 or something?
Sure, because I mean, if you're looking at it logically, that's what they should think about doing because they don't have a lot of picks. When you think about it, they gave up a third rounder and a fifth rounder for Leonard Williams, so they gave up a late pick for Isaac Yiadom last year, and a trade it didn't work out. But again, it's just kind of a throwaway pick. So if you're rebuilding your roster, if you're the Giants or any rebuilding team like this, you want to be able to have more draft picks, not fewer. And if you're at 11, you got to look at it and say, like you said, can I get a comparable player at 15 or 16, and then maybe pick up like a fourth round pick or something like that, or whatever the comparison would be in the draft trade value chart that you'd be able to get there. So, yeah, I think that's something they should consider. I don't know whether Dave Gettleman obviously goes against the grain of conventional wisdom a lot of times, and so we'll see what he does there.
Yeah, I'm going to shift to the Jets for a minute too. I think the Jet offseason has also been interesting because last year, I think you gave Joe Douglas truce here. He'd tell you he wasn't aggressive enough in free agency, and they've been a bunch of Band-Aids. What do you think about year 2 of Joe Douglas's free agency strategy?
Well, I think you have to look at it and say, do you trust this guy? And there's just not enough evidence one way or the other right now. He really only had one off season because he was hired after free agency in the draft in 2019, and his free agency signings were not great last year. You look at the guys he added on the offensive line, Greg Van Roten and Connor McGovern were not very good. You look at, Brashad Perriman was, like you said, one of those Band-Aid guys, didn't work out. Most notably, he let Robbie Anderson walk and leave for the Panthers, and they should have re-signed him at that price. Douglas admits it was a mistake. So, yeah, he goes ahead and drafts addresses in free agency. Well, typically the way teams do this is, you look at your biggest kind of glaring needs and you try to address needs in free agency, and then maybe go best player available in the draft. And they go with Corey Davis. They don't want to spend Galladay money. They sign Corey Davis, $27 million up front, same number they gave Le'Veon Bell. But they're going to need Davis to be a number one receiver. The guy's a former first-round pick who really has not lived up to it so far. And he has not produced as much as Galladay, obviously. It wasn't as expensive. So, I think those are question marks. Can these guys deliver on potential? You look at edge rusher was a major need for the Jets. They haven't had a true dominant edge rusher since really after the 2005 season when they traded John Abraham. And they get Carl Lawson from the Bengals. They signed him in free agency and gave him, I think, north of $30 million. So he was the big investment. Wound up eclipsing what Davis got. And again, a guy who is young, and you're paying for upside there. You're not paying for a guy with tread on the tire, which is an argument you probably could have made about Le'Veon Bell, certainly in retrospect and definitely in the moment. So yeah, I think the logic is sound on those picks. Now let's just see on those signings, I should say. Now let's just see if they work. They're not always guaranteed to work.
Yeah, they aren't. I was surprised personally that I know that two of the big needs they had really, at this point, as a recording, had not really addressed so far is the interior offensive line and the cornerback spot. Are you surprised basically sat out of free agency on those two spots?
The cornerback spot is a curious one, right? I think that Joe Douglas has to be looking at this draft and saying, with that second pick in the first round at number 23, there's a possibility that they certainly could draft a guy like J.T. Horn there if he falls. But another thing to remember: don't rule out Joe Douglas maybe trading up. I mean, one thing to remember is John Idzik in 2014, I think it was like 12 picks, and he just sat there and made all of them. He didn't use them to kind of maneuver around and be aggressive and trade up. And Joe Douglas is armed with a lot of draft capital, and it should be a situation here where he should definitely consider, if there's a guy at like 17 or 16 or something like that, say like Patrick Surtain is there, the cornerback from Alabama, his dad played in the NFL, and you really like him, package up, one of your extra third rounders or whatever it is, a fourth rounder or something, and move up and make that pick. Be aggressive if you think a guy can be a difference maker for you, because, they do have the ability to have some, wiggle room here with these extra draft picks, right? You don't have to sit there and make them all. And so that's where I think Joe Douglas has to be, has to at least think about being pretty aggressive with what he has in terms of draft capital.
Yeah, I agree with that. And obviously, number 2, we all know they're picking a quarterback. It seems like it's 99% sure it's Zach Wilson. You think it's the full lock? Or you think there's a small outside chance they go somewhere else at quarterback?
Oh, I mean, yeah, I'm sure. Sure, there is a small chance, but I think everyone sort of looks at Zach Wilson and says he's the number 2 guy. I don't think it's not as certain. Like Wilson as the second guy over Fields or Lance or whatever is not as certain as Trevor Lawrence is being the number 1 guy, right? I mean, we can look back on this years from now and not even that many years from now and figure out, hey, maybe the conventional wisdom was wrong. I mean, you look at Sam Darnold. He, for various reasons, has not turned out to be as good of a player as Josh Allen. A lot of that has to do with the player himself. A lot of that has to do with the supporting cast. So, yeah, I think, he's not always right. I mean, you look at Lamar Jackson in that draft. He was drafted at the end of the first round. So, what we always think going into the draft isn't always necessarily right. Mitch Trubisky, guy hasn't panned out. So, yeah, I think it's almost certain that the Jets pick Trevor Lawrence or pick Zach Wilson. That would be the quote unquote safe pick. But then again, so was Darnold, right? I mean, Darnold was a safe pick at 3. I mean, most people would have looked at that and said, "Gee, it's a reach if you take Josh Allen at 3." But what if they did? We'll never know if things might have turned out differently for the Jets over the past couple of years.
Yeah, I think that pick is not even very interesting for them because you know where they're going. The 23, you mentioned earlier, I think is fascinating because they could sit put where they are and get somebody who's pretty good. They could trade up, like you mentioned. They could trade down. I mean, I feel like it also feels like the odds are against them just sitting at 23 and picking. I feel like they're going to move one direction or another depending on what the board looks like.
They could, yeah. I think they could because, look, it's not like they just have one area of need. I mean, I mentioned, they did bring in an edge rusher on Carl Lawson. He kind of projects as a 4-3 defensive end as they move from a 3-4 defense to a 4-3 under Robert Saleh. They also, the Jets, do have outside linebacker question marks and issues. I mean, they let Jordan Jenkins leave in free agency. He's more of a 3-4 outside linebacker, so he's gone. And they need to figure out who will play next to C.J. Mosley in their linebacker group. And do they have a guy who can fit there? Would there the kid from Georgia, Azeez Ojulari, I guess is how you say his name, and he's a potential edge rusher prospect for them. Again, I mentioned Rousseau. I don't think Phillips will be there at 23, but if Gregory Rousseau is a fascinating prospect, is down there. Look at this. Carl Lawson is not going to be a cure-all for their pass rush. I mean, they expect a lot of them, but they feel pretty good about their interior defensive line. They bring in Sheldon Rankins. The interior defensive line, I meant, Quinn Williams, of course, and they bring in Sheldon Rankins, a guy who can be a situational pass rusher, former first-round pick from the Saints. So they have some pieces on their defensive line, but certainly they could afford to bolster their pass rush a bit more if they want to do that. But the biggest issue is cornerback. They have to get a cornerback. They really do. I mean, they have 2 holes there. I don't see. And then Brian Poole, their slot cornerback, remains a free agent. They may or may not bring him back. So all 3 of their cornerback spots have question marks, which is a problem, obviously.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and they're going to have to solve it in the draft. And I think the draft as a whole, I think it's going to be a very interesting draft because besides the obvious of them going back to in-person event to some degree and all that, I think there's potential for a lot of trades in that top 10. I think that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I think you already have seen a lot of movement there because teams are getting, kind of desperate at quarterback. I mean, they're more and more willing to make a quick trigger decision on a guy like Darnold or Jimmy Garoppolo, say in San Francisco, who they just say, hey, he's not going to be our guy anymore. So, and they really, the 49ers mortgage their future on moving up from 12 to 3. And there are a lot of teams there who could continue to move. I think the Panthers at 8, and they could take a quarterback there. Just because they traded for Sam Darnold doesn't mean he's going to be their guy going forward. Obviously, it's unlikely. The Broncos, maybe, if a guy falls to them who's enticing, because Drew Lock hasn't exactly proven himself. So there are some possibilities there that if a quarterback or two falls after, say, the first two is when things get really interesting, right? So Fields maybe to who goes 3, right? Is it Fields? Is it Lance? Say Lance goes 3, then Fields is there. Does a team make a move to 4 in a deal with Atlanta? Does Atlanta take Fields? So I think that becomes the question mark, because obviously, Matt Ryan is not the long-term solution for the Falcons. So that's when the draft really gets interesting at 3, and then certainly at 4.
Yeah, I think also I'm watching closely to see like if one of those quarterbacks ends up slipping down to like 7, 8, and Broncos are sitting there at 9. Do you see a team like maybe New England or the Bears or Washington try and jump the Broncos to get a quarterback?
I was just going to mention the Patriots, because it's not like Cam Newton is a long-term solution there. We saw that much last season. So the Patriots have been super aggressive this offseason, and I would not rule that out. I mean, you look at every year there's a team that takes a quarterback and you look at it like, wow. It was the Packers with Jordan Love, right? And no one really saw that one coming. So I would not rule it out. The Patriots have been in aggressive mode all off season here with free agency, and I think that if they can put together a package to move up, then I would not rule that out. If they like Fields, I think, or if they like Lance, Mac Jones, don't forget about him, the kid from Alabama. So ultimately, I think all of those quarterbacks wind up going in the first round at some point. It's just a matter of where. And if you look at the NFL at this point, probably like half the teams at least have either major or somewhat major question marks at quarterback, and whether that's their incumbent getting older and moving on or what. And the Lions, of course, they traded for Jared Goff, but it's not like it's like the same thing with Darnold. They don't know if he's going to be their answer long term, so they have to keep their options open as well. I think they're at to get 7. So a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, I think also if there's a big run on quarterbacks early, it benefits both the locals because that pushes some of the higher end talent a little further down the board, making more sense. I think the Giants sitting at 11. I think they're praying for like a run of like at least 4 or 5 quarterbacks in that top 10 so they can get more options at 11.
Certainly a receiver will be one of those if they want to go with like Jalen Waddle. Now at this point with them signing Galladay, I don't know if they would pick a receiver there. Then again, you don't know. Darius Slayton remains unproven over the long haul. Didn't really take the next step last year. Sterling Shepard, he kind of is what he is at this point. But yeah, I think the Giants would love to see a guy fall to them at 11 who maybe otherwise wouldn't, for sure.
All right, Darryl, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can people follow social media, keep up with your coverage of the Star Ledger?
Yeah, so we're at nj.com/Jets and nj.com/Giants, and then at Darryl Slater on Twitter, DARRYLSLATER. So appreciate everyone reading, and thanks for having me on.
No problem. Thanks again for taking the time. I appreciate it.
No problem.